My name is Margaret Elaine Calloway. I am 68 years old, and until 14 months ago, I believed the most important decision left in my life was whether to plant impatiens or begonias along the front walk. I had lived in the same house for 39 years, the white clapboard, colonial on Birchwood Lane in Millhaven, Vermont, with the green shutters my late husband Donald had painted himself the summer before his first stroke, the porch where we had drunk our morning coffee for 3 decades, the kitchen where I had canned 14 varieties of jam, raised 2 children, and cried more times than I could count. Most of those tears in the last 4 years, after Donald's second stroke left him a different man, and then his third stroke left him gone entirely. Donald passed on a Tuesday in March, 2 years before the morning this story truly begins. He went quietly, which was a mercy. He had been a loud man in life, opinionated, broad-shouldered, full of laughter and occasional nonsense, and I think he would have wanted to leave without a fuss, even if the fuss had been his own. After he was gone, I did what widows do. I thanked people for casseroles. I sorted through his clothes and gave the good ones to the church thrift sale. I learned to sleep in the middle of the bed instead of the left side. I answered when my daughter called on Sundays and said I was fine, and sometimes I even believed it. But the house was too large for one person. I knew it the way you know a coat no longer fits. Not because it looks wrong, but because you feel the extra space around you every time you put it on. 4 bedrooms, a basement full of Donald's woodworking tools that none of his children wanted and I didn't have the heart to sell. A yard that had once been a project and now felt like a responsibility I couldn't keep up with. My knees had started talking to me in ways they never had before. The furnace repair had cost more than I wanted to think about. The gutters needed attention I couldn't give them. My son Robert said I should move to something smaller. My daughter Patricia said I should wait and not make any rash decisions. My neighbor Vera said the market was good and I'd get more than I expected. Everyone had an opinion, which is what people do when they love you and cannot fix the actual problem. I listed the house in September. The realtor, a young woman named Courtney, who wore expensive shoes and spoke very fast, told me we would likely see offers within 2 weeks. She was right. 3 came in the first 10 days. 2 were from young families. 1 was from an investment company that wanted to convert the house into rental units, which made me feel something I could not quite name, a quiet protectiveness, the way you feel when a stranger picks up something fragile without knowing what it is. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in early October, a man came to see the house alone. His name was Edward Marsh. He was 71 years old, though I did not know that yet. He was tall, with gray hair that had once been dark and still remembered it. And he wore a canvas jacket the color of old pine needles. He came without an agent. He knocked on the front door instead of going around back the way Courtney had told visitors to do. And when I opened the door, he looked at me, not at the house behind me, not past my shoulder the way buyers do, but at me, with the particular directness of a person who has stopped wasting time on indirection. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'm Edward Marsh. I hope you don't mind that I knocked. I wanted to see the house from the front first. I always think the front tells you the most about how a place was loved." I did not know what to say to that. I had been told by Courtney to be pleasant, but not too forthcoming, to let the house speak for itself, not to negotiate or discuss terms. I said, "Come in, Mr. Marsh," and stepped aside. He walked through every room, slowly. Not the way young buyers walk through, opening cabinets and checking water pressure. He walked the way you walk through a place when you are trying to understand it. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking out at the yard where the sugar maple had gone red, and the last of my tomato cages were still standing in the garden bed. He touched the doorframe in the hallway, lightly, with 2 fingers, the way you might touch something that has been waiting for attention. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked up, and I saw something move across his face that I recognized only because I had seen it in the mirror. He was a man who had lost something, and he was looking for somewhere to put what was left of himself. He did not say much until we were back in the kitchen. I had put on coffee, old habit, the kind that lives in your hands before your head approves of it, and I set 2 cups on the table without thinking. He sat down and wrapped both hands around the mug, the way people do in cold weather, even though the kitchen was warm. He said, "My wife was named Louise. She passed 3 years ago. We lived in a condominium in Hartford because she liked the convenience of it. I never minded. But after she was gone, the convenience stopped feeling like a feature and started feeling like a symptom. Everything was too easy to walk away from. Nothing required any tending. I listened. I had learned, in the 2 years since Donald died, that most people talk to fill the silence, and that very few people actually have something to say. Edward Marsh had something to say. He told me he had grown up on a farm in New Hampshire, that he had spent 40 years as a civil engineer and had built things, bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure nobody photographs but everybody needs, and that he had always felt more himself in the presence of things that required upkeep, a garden, a porch, a furnace that occasionally needed coaxing. He said condo living had made him feel like a guest in his own life. I said, "And you think this house would change that?" He looked at me. He had steady eyes, gray-green, the color of lichen on stone. He said, "I think this house was cared for. I can tell the difference." We sat there for a while. The maple outside the window shifted in the wind. I refilled his cup without asking, and he did not seem surprised. He made an offer the next day, through Courtney. It was fair, not the highest offer I had received, but within reason. Courtney said I should counter. I said I would think about it. What I thought about was not the number. I thought about the way he had touched the doorframe, the way he had said Louise's name, the way he had looked at the yard and seen the tomato cages, and not asked why they were still standing in October, because he already knew, because there are things you leave standing when you are not ready to put them away. Courtney called me the next morning and said Mr. Marsh had added a note to his offer. She read it to me in her brisk, efficient voice, as though it were simply another clause. It said, "I am aware this house has been someone's home for a long time. I want you to know I intend to treat it that way. I would also like to say, and I recognize this is unusual, that I hope you'll still have coffee here sometimes. The kitchen suits you." I made Courtney read it twice. Then I called her back an hour later and said I was not accepting the offer. She thought I wanted more money. I let her think that for exactly one day before I told her the truth, which was that I had decided not to sell the house at all. Not yet. Not that way. Not to walk out of a door I had walked through for 39 years without. And I did not know exactly how to say this, without making sure that what came after was something I had actually chosen, rather than something I had simply allowed to happen, because everyone around me believed it was the practical next step. Courtney did not entirely understand. That was all right. I was 68 years old and a widow, and I had spent a great deal of my life making sure other people understood my decisions. I had decided to stop requiring that of myself. I called the number Edward Marsh had written at the bottom of the note. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Mr. Marsh, this is Margaret Calloway. I'm not selling the house." There was a pause. Then he said, "I see." I said, "But I thought, if you weren't opposed to it, we might take a walk. The property goes back farther than the listing suggests. There's a stream you can't see from the yard. I'd like someone else to see it before I decide anything." Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "When?" I said, "Saturday morning, if the weather holds." He said, "I'll bring the coffee this time. I will tell you what I did not tell my daughter Patricia, or my son Robert, or my neighbor Vera, which is that I stood in the kitchen after I hung up the telephone and felt something I had not felt in so long. I had almost forgotten what it was called. Not love, not yet. Nothing so large or so frightening as that. Something smaller and older, the way a window feels when you open it in April, after a long winter. Not warm yet, but the cold no longer the only thing. He came Saturday with 2 cups in a cardboard carrier from the diner in town, and a pair of waterproof boots that told me he had taken the walk seriously. We went through the back gate, down the slope behind the garden beds, through the stand of white birch that went gold in fall and skeletal in winter, and out to the small stream that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Donald had called it a creek. I had always called it the stream. We had never settled the argument. Edward stood at the bank and watched the water for a while. The leaves were coming down in a slow, steady way, landing on the surface and moving off downstream. He said, "My grandfather had a piece of land in New Hampshire with a stream like this. I spent summers there when I was young. I haven't thought about it in years." I said, "Why not?" He looked at me. "Louise didn't like the country. I got used to not thinking about the things she didn't like. You do that. In a long marriage. It isn't a complaint. It's just what happens." I knew exactly what he meant. I had stopped listening to Patsy Cline for 17 years because Donald said it made him melancholy. I had started again, 3 weeks after his funeral, and stood in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, listening to Crazy and thinking about all the things we set aside for each other without ever discussing it, and how you only notice the shape of them when the other person is gone. I said, "Donald called this a creek. I always said stream. We argued about it for 39 years and never decided." Edward said, "What do you call it now?"
I thought about it.
"Both, depending on the day." He smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile. It did something to his face that I was not prepared for, made it younger, more open, the way a house looks when someone finally turns on the lights. We walked back slowly. At the gate, he stopped and looked at the back of the house. The green shutters, the porch, the kitchen window, with the light coming through it. He said, "You're right not to sell yet. This house isn't finished with you." I did not answer right away. We went inside and I warmed his coffee, which had gone cold, and we sat at the kitchen table again and talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential and everything that mattered. His children, my children, the particular loneliness of grocery shopping for one, the way time moves differently after 60, both faster and slower in ways that make no logical sense but are completely true. He left at noon. At the door, he said, "Same time next week?" I said, "You're not buying the house." He said, "No. But you have good coffee and a stream worth arguing about." I said, "Creek." He looked at me. "There it is." After he drove away, I stood on the porch in the October cold and understood something I had been turning away from for the better part of 2 years. I had been so focused on the practical questions, what to sell, where to go, what comes next for a woman my age, that I had forgotten to ask the question underneath all the other questions. What do I still want? The answer, standing on the porch at 68 in the Vermont autumn with the maple going red and the coffee cooling in my hand, was something I had not allowed myself in a very long time. I wanted to be known, not taken care of, not managed, not transitioned into something more practical. Known, the way Edward Marsh had looked at this house and seen that it had been loved, and looked at me and seen the same thing. He came back the next Saturday, and the one after that. November came in gray and still. The leaves finished falling. The yard went brown and quiet, the way Vermont yards do before the first snow covers everything and makes the world look clean again. I put away the tomato cages, finally, deliberately, and raked the beds and covered them with straw. It was the first time in 2 years I had tended the garden with something other than obligation. I noticed that on the third Saturday, we stayed inside because the rain was steady and cold. I showed Edward the bookshelf in the living room where Donald had kept his woodworking books, and the 2 shelves I had filled over the years with novels and seed catalogs, and a worn copy of Laurie Colwin's food essays that I had read so many times the spine had cracked. Edward pulled out the Colwin without asking and read the back and said Louise would have liked this. I said, "Borrow it if you want." He looked at me and said, "I'll read it here." I did not argue. That afternoon, he told me about the bridges he had designed, not with the modesty that men sometimes use when they are secretly proud, but with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has done work that mattered and knows it. He said the thing he loved most about structural engineering was that a bridge either held or it didn't. There was no ambiguity. The math was either right or the math was wrong, and the river didn't care about your intentions. I said that sounded like farming. He said it probably did. We talked about what it means to spend a life doing work that is mostly invisible until it fails, which is true of bridges and kitchens and marriages alike, though I didn't say the last part out loud. On the 4th Saturday, he told me about his son Paul and his daughter Caroline. Paul was cautious and practical. a financial analyst who lived in Boston and believed in risk management the way other people believe in weather forecasts. Caroline was warmer, quicker to laugh, lived in Portland with her husband and their 2 teenage children. He said Caroline had cried at Louise's funeral in the particular way of a daughter who loved her mother and also knew her mother had not always been easy to love, and that complicated grief is sometimes the heaviest kind. I told him about Robert and Patricia in return. Robert, who lived 40 minutes away and visited reliably and was better at practical love, showing up, fixing things, not asking questions, than he was at the spoken kind. Patricia, who lived in North Carolina and called every Sunday and was better at the spoken kind than she was at showing up, which was its own form of love, just one that sometimes left you feeling both seen and alone. I said I was lucky to have both of them, which was true. I said I sometimes wished they could be combined into one slightly less anxious person, which made Edward laugh. We had a rhythm by then. Coffee first, then conversation, then either the walk or staying in depending on weather, then whatever needed to be said that week. He was not a man who filled silences unnecessarily. I had spent most of my adult life around people who were afraid of silence, who rushed to cover it with words or music or the television, and Edward's ease with quiet was something I had not known I was hungry for. My neighbor Vera noticed his car in the drive on the second Saturday. By the third, she was leaving small notes in my mailbox that said things like, "Just checking in," with more concern in those 2 words than most people convey in paragraphs. I appreciated it, and also found it slightly exhausting, which is the particular condition of being a woman of a certain age, whose friends love her. December came. The first snow fell on a Thursday evening. Light and dry, the kind that stays. When Edward arrived that Saturday, the yard was white, and the maple wore its snow the way old trees do, steadily, without fuss. He stood on the porch looking at it before he came inside and said, "I'd forgotten how quiet snow makes things." I said, "That's why I could never move somewhere without seasons. The quiet has to be earned." He looked at me in a way that meant something. I looked back in a way that meant something too. And then we went inside, because it was cold, and because some things don't need to be said on porches in December. And we had time. My daughter Patricia found out in December. She called on a Sunday, and I told her, in the careful way you tell your adult children things that are none of their business but that you love them enough to share anyway, that I had been spending time with a man, that he had come to look at the house, that he was a widower from Hartford, 71 years old, a retired engineer, thoughtful and quiet and very good at sitting in silence, in a way that felt like company rather than absence. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, are you sure about this?" I said, "I'm 68 years old, Patricia. I have been sure about very few things in my life, with the speed people seem to expect certainty to arrive. But I am sure that I feel more like myself on Saturday mornings than I have in 2 years, and I am not willing to question that," she said. "I just don't want you to get hurt." I said, "I know, but the alternative is to not feel anything, and I have already tried that for 24 months, and I can tell you from experience, it is not as safe as it sounds. My son Robert took it better," he said. "Is he a decent man?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Does he make you laugh?" I thought about the creek and stream argument. I said, "Yes." He said, "Then good. Dad would want you to have someone to argue with." Edward told his children in January. His daughter Caroline called him 3 times in 1 week. His son Paul came up from Boston and took him to dinner and asked, in the careful way adult children ask things they have already decided they disapprove of, whether he was sure he wasn't moving too fast. Edward told me about it on a Saturday afternoon in February, when the snow was coming down outside the kitchen window, and we had given up on the walk and stayed inside with soup I had made from the last of the autumn squash. He said, "Paul thinks I'm being impulsive. He's 44 years old, and he's worried about his 71-year-old father being impulsive." I told him that at my age, the risk isn't moving too fast. The risk is not moving at all. I put my spoon down and looked at him. We had been sitting at this table together, on and off, for 4 months. I knew by then that he took his coffee black, that he had a habit of reading the same page twice when something distracted him, that he was more patient with other people's mistakes than with his own, that he had cried once in my kitchen, just once, briefly, talking about the last summer he and Louise had spent together at a rental house in Maine, and that he had not apologized for it, which was one of the things I respected most about him. I knew that I had stopped thinking about him as the man who had come to look at the house. He was just Edward now, the way some people become just themselves to you, without the scaffolding of how you met them. I said, "My daughter said she didn't want me to get hurt." He said, "And what did you tell her?" I said, "I told her that not feeling anything is its own kind of hurt, just a quieter one." He looked at me for a long time. The snow came down. The soup steamed between us. He said, "Margaret." He had been calling me Margaret since October, but the way he said it in that moment was different. The way a word is different when it has had time to become familiar, when it has worn grooves in the speaker's mouth, when it is no longer an address but something closer to a declaration. He said, "I came to this house looking for something to tend, something that needed care and would hold still for it. I didn't expect." He stopped, tried again. "I didn't expect the house to be the least interesting thing about it. I will not pretend I did not feel that. I will not pretend my hands were steady when I picked up my coffee cup." I said, "You know, I still don't know if I'm selling." He said, "I know." I said, "You came here to buy a house." He said, "I came here to find somewhere I could put down roots. I'm not sure anymore that I care what the address is." The snow kept coming. We stayed at that kitchen table until it was dark outside and the yard had gone white and quiet, and neither of us mentioned that he should probably drive home before the roads got worse. And at some point I realized we had stopped talking and were simply sitting together in the kind of silence that is not empty but full of the particular comfort of two people who have stopped performing ease and have simply found it. He stayed for dinner. He helped me wash the dishes. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow in the yard, and I stood beside him, and we watched the maple in the dark, its bare branches, holding the cold and the quiet, the way old things do, steadily, without complaint. He left at 9. At the door, he put on his coat, and I handed him his scarf, and he looked at me, the way he had looked at the house the very first day, not to assess it, not to determine its value, but simply to see it. He said, "I'll be back Saturday." I said, "I know." And then I said, before I could decide not to, "Edward, next Saturday, don't bring coffee from the diner. I'll make it here." It was a small thing, but we both understood it was not a small thing. He smiled, that smile that made his face younger. He said, "I'll bring the creek." I said, "Stream." He said, "We'll see." Winter deepened. January was brutal that year, the kind of cold that Vermont locals describe with a certain grim pride, as if enduring it proves something about character. The pipes under the mudroom sink froze on a Tuesday night, and I woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of nothing. No water running, which is its own kind of alarm when you have lived long enough in an old house to know what that silence means. I called the plumber and waited, and while I waited I sat at the kitchen table with tea, and thought about how many Tuesday nights in 39 years I had sat in this kitchen alone while Donald slept through whatever problem the house had decided to present. I texted Edward at 7 in the morning, which was something I had started doing and which still surprised me. Not the texting itself, but the ease of it. The way I had started reaching for my phone, the way I used to reach for the telephone on the wall when something had happened and I wanted to tell someone. He texted back within minutes. He said, "Which pipes?" He said, "Has the plumber been?" He said, "Call me when it's sorted." He called at 9. Once the plumber had come and gone, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. And when we hung up, I realized my tea had gone cold, and I had not noticed. His daughter Caroline drove up from Portland in February, ostensibly to see a friend, though the visit included 2 hours at my kitchen table, drinking tea and asking me questions, with the careful, open-faced attention of a woman who has decided to make up her own mind rather than borrow her brother's. She was warm and funny, and not at all what I had expected, which is to say she was her father in many of the ways that mattered, and entirely herself in all the others. She told me about her husband and her teenagers, and about the way her mother had been in the last years. Difficult, then frightened, then gone, with the directness of someone who has processed grief enough to speak it without flinching. Before she left, she stood at the door and said, "He talks about your kitchen the way he used to talk about the house he grew up in, like it's a place he knows where he is." She looked at me steadily. "I wanted to see it for myself," I said. "And," she said, "and now I have." She hugged me before she went, which I had not expected, and which stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Spring came slowly that year, the way Vermont spring always does, reluctantly, in fits and starts. A warm day followed by a cold one, the mud season long and unglamorous. But the maple put out new leaves. The stream, or the creek, we still had not agreed, ran high with snowmelt, and on the first Saturday in April, that was warm enough, Edward and I walked down through the birches to the water and stood there listening to it move. He was holding my hand. I do not remember exactly when that had started. It had simply become the way we walked. He said, "I've been thinking." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I don't want to buy this house, Margaret." I waited. He said, "I want to help you keep it." I turned to look at him. He was watching the water. The new light came through the birches and caught in his gray hair and made him look for a moment like a man from a long time ago, like the young man he must have been before life had refined him into the one standing here. He said, "I know that's a large thing to say. I know we have children who will have opinions and practical considerations that are not unreasonable. And I know 68 and 71 is not 25, and we don't have the luxury of time the way we once might have thought we did. I know all of that. But I also know that this house has a stream worth arguing about, and you make the best coffee I have had in 3 years, and I have not felt like myself in a very long time, and I feel like myself on Saturday mornings. I feel like myself in your kitchen. I feel like myself when you call the creek a stream and refuse to apologize for it." He stopped. He looked at me. He said, "I'm not proposing anything you're not ready for. I just wanted to say it out loud." So it was said. So it existed somewhere other than in my own head. I held his hand. The water moved. A bird crossed somewhere in the birches with a sound like a small door opening. I said, "I called it a stream because my mother called it a stream. Her family's land had one just like it in upstate New York when she was a girl. She always said you could tell the character of a piece of land by its water, whether it moved honestly, whether it stayed." Edward looked at me. "And does this one stay?" I looked at the water, at the way it moved through the roots of the birches, around the flat gray stones, steadily the way water does when it has found its right path. I said, "It always comes back. Every spring, it comes back." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Then so will I." We stood there a long time after that, not speaking, the water moving at our feet, and the birches releasing the last of their dead leaves on the current. I thought about Donald, the way I often did in this spot. He had loved this part of the property most, had talked about building a little bench here one day, something low and simple, and had never gotten around to it. I thought about how you carry the people you have loved, not in the place of the living, but alongside them, the way you might carry a photograph in your wallet, not instead of the present, but beside it. I did not feel disloyal standing there. That was the thing I had been afraid of. In the months before Edward arrived, in the long, careful nights when I had talked myself out of wanting anything, I had been afraid that wanting something new would mean letting go of something old. But standing by the water with his hand in mine, I understood that it does not work that way. The love you have carried does not have to be put down for new love to be picked up. At my age, you know better than to believe the heart has a fixed capacity. I squeezed his hand. He looked at me. I said, "I'm not ready to decide everything, but I'm ready to stop deciding nothing." He nodded. That was enough. With Edward, that had always been enough. I have been asked, since then, by my daughter and my neighbor Vera, and once by a woman at church who meant it kindly, whether I worry, whether I wonder if it is too soon, too late, too complicated, too much to ask of myself at this point in life. I tell them what I know to be true, which is this. At 68, you have buried enough of the things you were waiting for to understand that waiting is not the same as wisdom. Donald taught me that, though not on purpose. He taught me by leaving on a Tuesday in March without any warning, the way people go when they go, without permission and without enough time to say all the things you meant to say on some quieter day. I will not wait for the quieter day. Edward comes on Saturdays, sometimes other days too. He fixed the loose board on the porch without being asked, because he is an engineer by nature and cannot walk past something that needs attention. He has started keeping a pair of boots in the mudroom, which my son Robert noticed when he visited in June and said nothing about, which was its own kind of blessing. Robert met Edward properly in May, on a Sunday when I had invited them both to dinner, and then pretended I had forgotten I had invited them both, which fooled neither of them, but gave everyone a graceful way to act natural about it. They talked for an hour about the shed Donald had built in the back corner of the yard, which listed slightly to the left, and which Edward had already mentioned needing new footings. Robert looked it over and agreed. They discussed footings and drainage, and the particular way Vermont soil moves in the freeze-thaw cycle with the focused pleasure of two men who understand that a problem worth solving is a form of conversation. When Robert left, he shook Edward's hand at the door. He caught my eye over Edward's shoulder and gave one small nod. It was enough. With Robert, it had always been enough. We still argue about the creek. We have made peace with the fact that we will always argue about it. There are worse things in a life than having something to gently disagree about with a person whose company you cannot imagine losing. The house is not for sale. I do not know what the next chapter looks like in every particular, but I know it takes place here, in this kitchen, with this coffee, at this table that has held 39 years of ordinary mornings and is not finished yet. At my age, you learn that love does not always arrive with music and certainty and perfect timing. Sometimes it knocks on the front door in a canvas jacket on a Wednesday in October and looks at your house and sees that it was cared for. And sometimes, if you are wise enough to open the door, it stays.